All right, so this is me, and normally I blow through this slide pretty quickly, but I'm not for this particular one simply from the standpoint that, oh, hang on, doink, tap to start. Hey, there we go. Little countdown timer so I know how long I have to go. Normally I blow through the bio pretty quickly, and actually that's what I tell most speakers is to blow through this fairly quickly. But in this particular case, for this one particular talk, I'm not, because if you look at it, you'll notice something that's kind of curious. I tend to go both ways. I do both Java and I do .NET, and as a matter of fact, I've also been getting more deep into the JavaScript world, and I've been spending a lot of time across a lot of platforms. As a matter of fact, I was a Microsoft MVP for a number of years, F#, C#, as well as the Architect program when it was around. I actually participated as part of the Java community process. So if you've ever written any Java code and you've ever used an annotation, those little @ things and on top of methods look very similar to C# custom attributes, you're welcome. That was my big contribution to the Java language. I've lived in a number of different places for many, many years. I've been doing this sort of polytechnical lifestyle for close on to 2 decades now. I actually started as a C++ developer, got into Java, got into .NET, getting into JavaScript. I teach mobile development at the University of Washington, both Swift or iOS and Android, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Part of that was because I made a decision very early in my career that I never wanted to be pigeonholed as a X developer. I never wanted to be a Java developer. I never wanted to be a .NET developer. I never wanted to be a Windows or a Linux. I wanted to be a developer. You give me a tool, I'll figure out how to use it, and I'll use it. The end. And it has served me well. But trying to come up with a name for that, it's more than just polyglot because it's more than just languages. It's also data storage, it's also platforms, et cetera. And trying to come up with that as well as talk about how to manage your career around that is kind of a hard thing. So I came up with the term polytechnical careering. The poly in polyglot, of course, means many. It means lots of, more than one, etc. For example, if you call somebody who speaks multiple foreign languages, right? If you go over to Europe and you talk to somebody who speaks English and French and German, we call them a polyglot. Somebody who only speaks one language, we call them an American. In the beginning, there was but one programming language, and its name was C. And everybody wrote C, and everybody was happy, for it was the only language. And yeah, you already don't believe me. That's not even close to the case, right? Going back all the way to the very, very earliest days of programming languages, there were always at least 2. The 2 principal ones in many respects were Lisp and Fortran begat a whole bunch of children, and Lisp was kind of that single loner for a long time, right? Lisp was just kind of hanging out there in the academia. Had a couple of, clones they made of it, Scheme and some other things. And it hasn't been until recently that the industry seems to have rediscovered a love affair with Lisp. Now we have Clojure. We're seeing some additional work around Lisp in terms of languages that run on top of the Erlang virtual machine and so on and so forth. And even aside from all of the various programming languages, there's always been a whole bunch of different ways in which to store data and machines on which to execute the code and the data that you want to reference and so on and so forth. Even if just something as simple as a command shell. This was actually one place where the DOS Windows community had it better than the Unix world, because the Unix world had like half a dozen different shells to use, and the Windows world only had one. And it was called command prompt. And it sucked, but you always knew that a batch file would run whenever you were running on top of Windows. And for a long time, DOS programmers thought, yay, batch files, yay. People are like, no, we never said that, ever. But the point is, there's a ton of them, and particularly if you ever try to take Corn Shell and Z Shell and C Shell and all these other shells and Sally sells seashells by the seashore, et cetera, it's kind of, wow, it's overwhelming. There's a whole bunch of stuff, And the platforms themselves certainly have emerged over time. May come as a huge surprise to you, but the CLR was not the first bytecode executing platform to hit the mainstream. As a matter of fact, it wasn't Java either. Back in the 70s, there was a classical second stage compiler called the P-code compiler. We're not quite sure if P was supposed to stand for Pascal because you compiled from Pascal into a standard intermediate format, and then you used this second stage compiler to compile that intermediate format into whatever targeted platform you were running on. This was back in the 70s, mind you. And there have been other platforms. Certainly Linux has gone a long way with effectively a C-based native layer platform. So as long as you know how to produce and consume a C entry point, people know how to consume your particular language, tool, platform, what have you. Microsoft, of course, after they got hugely successful with Windows, they decided they wanted to have a platform by which we could do a little bit more in the way of componentization. That became the component object model, which to some degree was a predecessor to what we now enjoy with the CLR, and so on and so on and so on. All of these platforms, with the possible exception of the first one, still exist today. So if you're going to want to interoperate with a variety of different things, you kind of want to have some level of conversant skill with all of these different platforms. And this leads to what I call the three polys. Polyglot, many languages, polypreclusio, many storages, and polycrepido, many platforms or many foundations. That is actual Latin, by the way. I'm not making those words up. Yeah, my linguist friend down here is nodding. She agrees with me. So, why would you want to do this? I mean, think about this for a second. If you're signing yourself up to be this kind of polyglot, polystore individual, you're saying, I don't want to just learn C#. I want to learn C#. I want to learn F#. I want to learn Java. I want to learn Scala. I want to learn Clojure. I want to learn Kotlin. I want to learn Swift. And then on top of that, I want to learn Mongo, and I want to learn SQL, and I want to learn Redis, and I want to learn Couchbase. And then I want to learn Linux, and then I want to learn Windows, and then I want to, and who has that kind of time? Yikes. Because all of this means that you're approaching a degree of complexity that isn't there if you just focus on one particular platform. Now, aside from the personal choice, I simply want to make sure, for example, that I will never lack for a job. Because, hey, if the .NET community collapses tomorrow, I still know Java. I can go get a job as a Java developer. Or if the Java community collapses tomorrow, well, I can still get a job as a Swift programmer. As long as I have skills that people want, I will never be unemployable. So there's that direct benefit there. But even within a project, do you really want to consider the idea of embracing multiple languages, multiple storages, multiple platforms? I mean, we saw the example up here earlier in terms of the distributed sagas and all the various networking systems and microservices. And one of the key things that everybody loves is the fact that microservices can be written in any language or platform that you enjoy. So how many of you feel really comfortable going in and fixing a bug in that Go code? Yeah, like one hand there at the back, right? That's it. I mean, but Go is like this really cool language, and who wouldn't want to learn it? And of course, the next bug is in Elixir, right? And the one after, there's one guy down here is like, yeah, I know it, but I don't want to raise my hand too high because then people will depend on me, right? I'll become the guy, and I'll never get any work done ever again, so I'll raise my hand, but please don't point me out. It's that guy right there. And then you start taking over that team. And now it's time to hire people to, like, because inevitably there's turnover in the team, right? There's churn, right? Some guy goes to a conference in Portland and gets run over by a bus or a train, or some Darth Vader wearing a skirt, playing the bagpipes, shooting fire, because it's Portland, right? Right? You haven't seen that? That was like 3 times already in the last hour. How do you staff a team when you bank on this notion of a polytechnical environment? There's all kinds of costs that sort of come along with this particular approach. Well, there's all kinds of benefits that go with it. There's always this cost-benefit trade-off analysis that you have to go through. How many of you have ever been on a project where the actual business logic seemed to be changing on a near daily basis? Or at least weekly? Yeah, a bunch of hands going up. How many of you ever tried to rent a car? Just out of curiosity. You ever talk to like the car rental agents on the phone? It's like, yeah, so I want to rent a car from Monday through Friday. They're like, we don't have any cars. You're like, you don't have any cars? No, we're all sold out. But looking at the system, if you rent it on the previous Sunday, if you start your rental on Sunday, we'll have a car for you. I'm like, how does that work? Are you printing them there at the rental depot or something? And then you're like, well, okay, but I'm actually not flying into the city until about 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday. Oh, that's fine. We'll just set the rental start time at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday and then schedule it for a late pickup, which means you'll get an extra couple of hours, and then you'll actually just show up late as your flight gets in at 8 o'clock and pick up your car on Monday. Even though you don't have cars on Monday, yeah, it'll work, trust me. And you're thinking, man, I never want to be the last guy into the rental car station because that's whose car I'm driving right now. And you're thinking, how does this make any sense whatsoever, particularly when you combine it with some of the other rules that if you pick up like an SUV, but it's over a Wednesday, but you're actually staying within a 50-mile limit, but you're also a silver member. Who has time to try to keep track of all of these rules? And especially to try to do so in an imperative object-oriented language like C# or even a functional object hybrid language like F#. There are actual languages out there that are specifically designed to deal with these kinds of logic issues. I give you Prolog, for example. If you've got scenarios where you have absolutely no idea how to code the domain logic. So for example, if you've ever worked for any sort of company that does any sort of science. I was teaching a class once for a company out in Denver. These are people who literally dig in the ground for oil. And they have some Fortran code that they wrote back in like the 70s to decide where to dig because they want to take certain soil samples and figure out how, saturated the soil. I don't even begin to understand the science, and I'm supposed to take those requirements and turn it into code? Seriously? Or there's a company out in Indiana, like flyover country. If you ever fly to Boston, about halfway through the trip, right, turn off the Avengers and wave out the window, and you'll be waving at the folks who sell crop insurance. This is a thing. The government will actually insure crops because the government can control the weather or something, I don't know. These guys have a very, very highly optimized risk prognostication program that they have written, and they actually wrote it as Excel macros. Yeah, Excel macros. It's this incredibly complex set of Excel macros in a set of sheets. And you're going to be the guy that's going to take that code and turn it into a C# ASP.NET program, right? And you're going to make sure it's all exactly correct, right? Or would you rather give the domain experts a tool that lets them express those complex formulae in a natural manner to them such that you can focus on the stuff surrounding that really tightly constrained domain level expertise? You can focus on like the web parts and the storage parts and if you get out of the silo that is C# or is Java, or is whatever language that you choose. I'm going to paraphrase Mr. Marx. Your job, from each tool, according to its abilities, to each project, according to its needs. And here, everybody thought communism wasn't good for anything. So for example, if you want to deal with logic changes that are happening on a regular basis, scripting languages. Embed a scripting language, and then in some cases, depending upon the degree of CS-ness that this language has, you may even be able to hand that language over to business analysts. Believe it or not, a lot of business analysts have a degree, to some degree, of technical knowledge. They actually can write code. I was doing some work for the University of California at Davis accounting department, and we were actually embedding a JavaScript interpreter. and allowing the analysts to write some of the complex financial rules, because they were getting it right there from the business experts. They were writing it in JavaScript right there next to said business people, who were then saying, yeah, okay, oh, but wait, there's this other scenario, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We were letting them write them as a series of declarative rules that would then be invoked. Basically, we were building a rules engine using JavaScript as the expressive part of the rules. If you've got complex permutations, like the rental car problem, again, there are what are called logic engines or logic languages. Prolog was designed specifically for this. As a matter of fact, with all of the reinvention of interest around artificial intelligence, Prolog is likely to make a resurgence of interest because it was developed initially for a lot of these AI kinds of problems. As a matter of fact, if you've ever tried to solve a Sudoku, or you wanted to write a program to solve a Sudoku, Prolog can do it extremely quickly. And it will handle all of the recursive possibilities for you. You simply have to declare the rules, as well as whatever facts are present inside of this problem. There are some rules engines, including one called Clips, which have been around since the 60s, and there is a flavor of Clips specifically for the CLR called Clips.net. And you can express these in a Lisp-like syntax this time instead of in straight Prolog. There are a number of these tools that will actually be able to help you through all of that logical decision-making without having to create an infinite number of nested if-elses. Creating a DSL, of course, this has been a subject for much discussion, particularly in the first half of this decade. Martin Fowler and a bunch of the folks at ThoughtWorks were really, really big into this. Fowler has a book, I think it's called Domain Languages Distilled or something along those lines. It's in his signature series, the black cover Addison Wesley books, talking about how to produce internal DSLs, external DSLs. But arguably, when Alistair was up here talking about Cake, one would argue that that is a DSL that builds on top of C# to provide a domain-specific expertise, in this case around doing builds. Rake is a similar DSL for doing builds in Ruby. Rails is a similar kind of DSL for building web applications in Ruby, et cetera. Now, those are technically favored DSLs. In other words, they're facing us as technologists to build something that non-technical, and really that's a terrible term, that gas and oil scientist, he's incredibly technical. It's just that he's not us. And that secretary who knows how to manipulate Word, he's really good at what he does, but he's also not us. And that woman who runs the school district, she's really good at what she does, but she's not us. They're technical in their own right. So we could give them tools that allow them to express their expertise in a manner that could be either directly or indirectly executable. That's the whole point of a DSL. And in many cases, we just find a general slew of requirements that simply don't fit one particular paradigm. There's a whole bunch of different examples here. I imagine if you sat and meditated for a few minutes, you could come up with a few of your own. Glenn up here mentioned the object relational Vietnam story, which, yes, I am the one that said object relational mapping is the Vietnam of computer science. It's really easy to get into and really, really hard to get out of. But right there is in the whole heart of that is the object relational impedance mismatch. Trying to take objects and force them into tables and relations doesn't work particularly well. Why not take objects and store them within an object database? Why not take relations and bring them into our programming languages? When we're dealing with certain things that are naturally tree structured, let's use graphs, Neo4j and Titan and some of these other databases that are emerging. Why does everything have to somehow get forced into SQL Server? It shouldn't. It does not have to. And if you found a particularly powerful tool that executes on top of the Java virtual machine, you do not need to rewrite it. You can just invoke it. The prevalence of HTTP APIs is making this easier every day. But at the end of the day, the JVM is just a library, just like the CLR is. And so if you spend a little time learning how to use JVM from JNI, the Java Native Invocation API, you can actually load and host the CLR and the JVM inside the same process, if you so desired. It's doable. I'm not saying you would want to build that out of the gate with a greenfield project, but show of hands, how many people are working on a brand new greenfield project, didn't exist up until you wrote file new solution? Show of hands. Yeah, you guys, you have it kind of nice, just shut up. The rest of us are working with 10-year-old code bases where decisions were made, and they were the best decisions at the time, but now we have to figure out how to amend them and work with them and extend them and maintain them and so on and so on and so on. And if you have a team that has a wide range of skills, how many of you are the smartest person on your team? How many of you are the dumbest person on your team? How many of you have no idea where you sit on your team? Now, really important question. How many of you are part of a team that has people smarter than you? And how many of you are on a team that has people not as smart as you? So what's the one-size solution for a group of people who have such a disparate range of skills? Do we program to the dumbest person in the room, or do we program to the smartest person in the room? Or do we maybe give the appropriate tool set to each individual in the room according to what they can handle? Take somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of experience with the distributed systems and let them work on something on the front end. Maybe they're using Elm. And take somebody who's got a lot of experience with distributed systems but has no clue around user interface because they still think the blink tag is cool, and have them working with actors in Scala on the back end, and so on and so on and so on and so on. By having a wide variety of tools that we can draw from, we can actually tailor the tools that the team is using based on the skill set that they exhibit and or are willing to learn. There are a lot of people who could tell you this could never work, that this notion of mixing and matching technologies like this in almost a mishmash fashion, this could never actually make anything actually ship. Except it did. 10 years ago, Barack Obama was elected president precisely because his team brought together a whole collection of volunteers with skill sets all the way up and down the entire gamut. People who had never actually programmed before, all the way up through people who had written academic papers. They all came from a disparate collection of different languages, different platforms. They got thrown together in a room and said, hey, you need to help us do election analysis so we can figure out what states to cover, what districts to cover, where does Barack need to show up in order to get elected. And he did. They built a system and deployed it and dismantled it in 583 days in order to elect the President of the United States. It can happen. It can be done. But you have to do it deliberately. You have to approach it very methodically and very intelligently. What you want to be, if you are an individual, you want to be what people are referring to as a T-shape. If we think about all of the different kinds of things you could learn, and if we think about the degree to which you learn it, we talk about going really deep on a particular subject, that's your vertical axis. We talk about being particularly broadly educated, that's your horizontal axis. You want to be a T-shaped individual. You want to have some breadth. You want to have looked at other things. For all that people have made fun of the F-sharpers in the room, they're onto something. Not whether or not they actually use F-sharp at work, but as a C-sharp developer, if you've never used a functional language before, F-sharp is a natural place to go because it is an object functional hybrid language. And using F-sharp will warp your brain in a good way because it will force you to think about things that you hadn't really thought about as a C-sharp developer. You have a new appreciation for tuples, for example, and the notion of being able to pass functions around as first-class parameters. And suddenly, LINQ makes sense if you spend time in F-sharp. But it's not just about that. C-sharp, F-sharp, but if you really, really, really want to understand objects, you should go back to the granddaddy of them all. You should look at Smalltalk. Because the Smalltalk browser is intrinsically wrapped up within that language and within that platform. And you will begin to understand why Alan Kay stood up on a stage and said, I invented the term object-oriented, and I can tell you that C++ was not what I had in mind. He fully meant objects. He knew what he was doing. But the way Smalltalk thinks about the world in terms of objects is very, very different from the way C++ and its direct descendants, Java and C#, think about objects. And so on and so on and so on. I could go on for days over all the different things. What you want to do is you want to formulate your own ontology. You want to form your own categorization system. When I say the word to you, Dylan, you say, I have no idea what Dylan is. Well, it's a programming language. Okay, so now you know that it's a programming language. Your goal then is to figure out, what language is this? Where does it fit? What made it interesting? Why was Apple invested in it in some way, shape, or form? And when you look at Swift and when you look at Kotlin, why are these languages interesting today? And I tell you, oh, they're just object-oriented languages. Fine, okay. And now I start to see how these languages start to group together. When you start talking about NoSQLs, and I say Mongo, CouchDB, Cosmos DB, Couchbase, where do they fit in relation to one another? Everybody has a slightly different view of how the categories should look. You need to build one of those for yourself. I was never a fan of our previous Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, but the man had it right when he said that there are three kinds of knowledge in the world. There are that which you know, that which you know you don't know, and a bunch of these languages that I have just rattled off, that's in that second category. You now know that you don't know these things. Then there's that which you don't know that you don't know. And your job, if you're going to be Polytechnical, is to get as much stuff out of category 3 and put it into category 2. Because at least if you know it exists, you can go research it. If you don't know it exists, you would never even begin to think to look. You want to pursue dissimilar angles. In other words, you know C#, great, don't learn Java. Seriously, don't learn Java. Not because Java is a terrible language, but because it is C#. They are evil twin brothers fighting over who gets to inherit the throne when the king dies. The king, of course, being COBOL. They are exactly the same, modulo a few things. That's not interesting. Why would you want to go learn the same? Go learn Clojure. It's a Lisp that runs on top of the JVM. Or go learn Kotlin, which is an object-oriented language, yes, but it's actually incorporating some interesting functional features, much the same way that Swift does for iOS. Or go learn JavaScript if you haven't already. And I don't mean JavaScript meaning I'm going to go find something that works on somebody's web page, cut and paste it, put it on my web page, and see if it still works, JavaScript. I mean actually sitting down and reading JavaScript, the good parts, and discovering why JavaScript has such a strange relationship with this, and so on and so forth. Explore dynamic languages, explore Ruby, Python, etc. Play around with something that's different from what you currently know, because learning the same, boring. For each thing that you approach, create your own, what I will call, evaluation function. It's hard to evaluate things when you're approaching them with entirely different kinds of projects. So imagine a really simple thing, whether it's a to-do list, whether it's a soccer registry for your kids' youth soccer team, or whether you're part of a company baseball team and you want to track people's statistics, whatever. Something that's not too big, something that doesn't require too much scale and certainly not much monetary investment, but something that isn't just a CRUD app, because everybody can do a CRUD app. We've been able to do that since 1990. Boring. Do something different, but that's personal, because you want to be able to evaluate it against its features for you. Run this thing through that. Try to build this thing with whatever tool we're considering. And sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. And that's okay, because you learn more from the failures than you do from the successes. Meanwhile, don't be afraid. More importantly, don't be afraid to give up. If you play around with small talk and you're like, this just doesn't make any sense to me, that's fine, walk away from it. There is no shame in that. There's absolutely no shame in saying, I just don't get it, maybe I'll come to it later, maybe I won't. Personally, I hate Perl. I tried Perl for a month or so and just, nope, thank you, I'm out of here. This thing just makes absolutely no sense to me, and I've never gone back. And you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm totally okay with that, because Perl is also now going away. So, you know, maybe I called it right there. Meanwhile, if you're a manager, there's things you can do to try to encourage this. For starters, when you hire people, don't hire people who are .NET developers or people who are Java developers. Hire developers. Hire people who are smart. Give them the tools to let them come up to speed on whatever your stack is, and then get out of their way. Turn them loose. Embrace the polytechnical individual. Don't look for cogs, look for people that can stand out. Make the education a formal part of their employment is necessary in order to support that, because if you're going to hire somebody to work at your company and you're a Java and you're hiring somebody who's .NET, they're going to have to pick up the Java from somewhere, or vice versa. So make sure that you support them explicitly, whether that's some sort of online subscription, aka a plural site, or LinkedIn Learning, or whether that's holding brown bags at lunch, or whether you have an explicit mentoring program within the company, which is probably the best of all. Make it a formal part of what you offer your team. Establish formal dissent. Nothing is more effective in a meeting than somebody standing up and saying, I disagree. It is hard to do, because the meeting has stretched out and gone on, and we're like, okay, come on, it's almost lunchtime, we've got things to do, and to stand up and say, I disagree is really, really hard. But it's necessary, because other people, if they had any doubts, they don't want to be that person. I have pissed off so many friends over the years, because I am known as a contrarian. I will argue anything with anybody, in case that wasn't already apparent. So if you come up to me and say, the sky is blue, I will find a way to say you're wrong. And I may be wrong. But you know what? The act of dissent will force you to think about your position more clearly and force you to articulate things. And you may discover that, no, you're really, really convinced this is the right thing to do. Or, wow, you know, actually, the more I think about it, maybe there are some holes here that we need to plug. Establish a culture of dissent in order to allow the best kinds of conversations to occur. Consensus sucks. Let's all agree to that. Establish some non-business goals and constraints. Not everything is about technology. How will this help the business? That's an important aspect of anything you do here with respect to your team. And discover what is core business. What is actually important to our company? How do we make money? What do we do that actually puts money in our pockets? And if you don't know, well, A, you're just begging to be terminated because you're not thinking about how you can best help the business. But B, okay, we're not business folks. Let's go talk to other people. Let's go talk to the boss. Let's find out from him, how do we make money? What do we consider our core business? You'll learn something. You'll demonstrate an interest in the business as a whole, and you'll be able to better evaluate this technology and see whether or not it actually works according to where you want to go. And accept that not all members are the same. Turns out we are all a little different. And we like coming to these events because we can all be different together. But we're still all different. I have a different skill set. I have a different perspective than even some of the people who work for me. And when one of them comes to me and says, hey, I think maybe we want to take this approach as to that one, it's my responsibility not to say, oh, well, I've been doing this thing a lot longer than you, so I just know better. It's up to me to say, you know what? Okay, let me hear that. Let me at least hear it. Let me at least give it a fair shake. Disagree with what I'm saying. Let's evaluate it. And if it turns out I'm right, great. If it turns out I'm wrong, even better. Because then other people are involved, other people are engaged, and it's not just my vision that somehow is successful only if I get it right. Different skill sets, different perspectives, they have different tools than what you do. And in some cases, they will be right regardless of the disparity in years of experience. It is not the easiest thing in the world to embrace this lifestyle and to embrace a team in this lifestyle. But you know what? It pays off in spades in the long run. And to my money, it's well worth it. Peace.